The sun was setting over the city of Kano, painting the sky with streaks of gold and orange. In a quiet corner of a grand estate stood a small security post, where Jonathan spent most of his days. He was a tall man in his mid-30s, with a kind face that could instantly put anyone at ease. His job was to guard the gates of Mrs. Juliet's mansion, a sprawling property with towering walls and lush gardens. The mansion was the pride of the neighborhood, its grandeur unmatched by any other house on the street. Jonathan had been working there for 3 years. His boss, Mrs. Juliet, was a woman of immense wealth and mystery. She was 48, strikingly elegant, and lived alone except for her maid and Jonathan. Despite her polished exterior, there was something about her that always felt off. Jonathan had never seen her husband or any close family. Visitors came and went, mostly young men in their 20s, but Jonathan never questioned it. His job was to guard the gate, not to pry into the affairs of the woman who paid his wages. Every few days, Jonathan received a visit from his oldest and dearest friend, Frank. They had been friends for 22 years, ever since they were kids growing up in the same neighborhood. Frank was blind, but his sharp mind and warm heart made him one of the most remarkable people Jonathan had ever known. They were inseparable, their bond built on trust and loyalty. Frank often joked that Jonathan was his eyes, and Jonathan always laughed, saying he was happy to lend them. Frank was a frequent visitor at the security post. His world was a dark one, but being with Jonathan always brought light into his life. He trusted Jonathan completely, feeling safe and understood in his company. It wasn't easy for Frank to navigate life as a blind man, but Jonathan made sure he never felt alone. They shared everything: jokes, stories, and even dreams of a better future. One quiet afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows on the driveway, Frank arrived at the gate. Jonathan was sitting in his chair, sipping a cup of tea. He smiled as he saw his friend approaching, guided by the familiar rhythm of his white cane tapping against the ground. "Jonathan, are you there?" Frank called out. "Always," Jonathan replied, his voice warm. He stood up and guided Frank to the shaded bench by the post. "How's your day going, my friend?" Frank asked, settling down. "Same as always," Jonathan said. "Watching the gate, keeping the peace. You know how it is." Frank chuckled. "And Mrs. Juliet? Still as mysterious as ever?" Jonathan hesitated. He rarely spoke about his boss, but he knew Frank was curious. It's complicated," he said carefully. "Rich, powerful, and always busy. But there's something about her. I don't know how to explain it." Frank nodded. "Well, as long as she treats you well, that's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the warm breeze. Frank loved visiting the estate. The gardens smelled of blooming flowers, and the chirping of birds made him feel like he was in a peaceful oasis far from the chaos of the city. As they talked, a sleek black car pulled up to the gate. Jonathan stood up quickly, recognizing Mrs. Juliet's vehicle. He opened the gate and the car rolled in smoothly. Through the tinted window he caught a glimpse of her face. She looked as composed as ever, her sharp features framed by perfectly styled hair. But for a brief moment she turned her head and noticed Frank sitting by the security post. Her eyes lingered on him, a strange glint of interest flashing across her face. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but the way she looked at Frank made him uneasy. The car disappeared into the driveway and Jonathan returned to the bench, trying to shake off the strange feeling. "Was that her?" Frank asked, sensing the change in Jonathan's demeanor. "Yeah," Jonathan replied, forcing a smile. "Just her usual business meeting. Nothing to worry about." But deep down he couldn't ignore the unease. Mrs. Juliet's mansion was a place of luxury and secrets. The halls were lined with expensive artwork, and the air always smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood. The maid, Grace, was the only other permanent resident of the house. She was a quiet woman in her early 30s who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Jonathan sometimes wondered if she, too, felt the peculiar atmosphere of the mansion. That evening, as Mrs. Juliet sat in her lavish living room, sipping a glass of red wine, she couldn't get Frank out of her mind. There was something about him, his vulnerability, his trust in Jonathan, that intrigued her. She had a dark side, one she carefully hid from the world. Beneath her polished exterior was a woman who thrived on control, power, and a twisted sense of pleasure. Young men often found themselves drawn into her web, only to leave broken and lost. The sight of Frank had sparked an idea in her mind, one that she couldn't shake. She decided she needed to know more about him. The next morning she called Jonathan into her living room. He entered hesitantly, his cap in his hands. "You wanted to see me, ma'am?" he asked, standing stiffly by the door. "Yes, Jonathan," she said smoothly, her eyes cold and calculating. "I saw your friend yesterday. The blind man. Frank, is it?" Jonathan nodded, his stomach tightening. "Yes, ma'am. He's my closest friend." Mrs. Juliet smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He seems interesting. Tell me about him." Jonathan hesitated. He didn't like the way she said it, but he had no choice but to answer. "He's a good man," he said. "Honest, kind, and hardworking even with his condition. We've been friends since we were kids." Mrs. Juliet nodded, leaning back in her chair. "I see. Well, he must be very lucky to have a friend like you." Jonathan forced a smile, but his instincts were screaming at him. Something wasn't right. As he left her living room, his mind was racing. He didn't know why Mrs. Juliet was suddenly interested in Frank, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to protect his friend no matter what. That evening, Frank returned to the gate as he often did. They sat together talking and laughing just like old times. But Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that their world was about to change, and not for the better. In the distance, the mansion loomed, its lights glowing softly against the dark sky. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But Jonathan knew better. Beneath its luxurious exterior lay secrets that could destroy lives. And now, Frank was unknowingly stepping into the shadows of that world. The days passed quietly, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mrs. Juliet had been unusually attentive to him, asking more questions about Frank each time they spoke. She often lingered at the gate when she arrived home, her gaze drifting toward the security post as if she expected to see Frank there. Jonathan did his best to deflect her interest, but the unease in his chest only grew stronger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mrs. Juliet called Jonathan into her living room again. The room smelled of her expensive perfume, a scent that somehow felt both inviting and suffocating. She sat behind her ornate desk, her fingers lightly tapping the polished surface. "Jonathan," she began, her voice smooth and deliberate, "I have a proposition for you." Jonathan stiffened. "What kind of proposition, ma'am?" Mrs. Juliet leaned forward, her piercing eyes locking onto his. "Your friend Frank. I want him to come here. Not just for a visit, but to stay." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "Stay? Why, ma'am? He has his own place and he's comfortable there." She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that brought comfort. It was cold, calculated. "I have my reasons. Let's just say I find him intriguing. And I'm willing to make it worth your while." Jonathan frowned, confusion swirling with unease. "I don't understand, ma'am. Frank is my friend. Why would he want to live here?" Mrs. Juliet's smile didn't waver. Instead, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the desk. "Open it," she said. Jonathan hesitated, then picked up the envelope and opened it. His breath caught in his throat. Inside was more money than he had ever seen in his life. "This is for you," Mrs. Juliet said, her tone as smooth as silk. "And there's more where that came from. I can pay you monthly. Enough to change your life, Jonathan. Enough to make all your struggles disappear." Jonathan's hands trembled as he held the envelope. It was a fortune, more than he could ever dream of earning as a security guard. But the weight of her words pressed down on him like a heavy stone. I can't do that," he stammered, placing the envelope back on the desk. "Frank is my friend. I can't just sell him to you like he's some kind of object." Mrs. Juliet's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "Think carefully, Jonathan. This is a rare opportunity. Frank trusts you, doesn't he? He would follow you anywhere. All you have to do is bring him here. The rest is none of your concern." Jonathan shook his head, his voice firm despite the fear rising in his chest. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't betray my friend like that." Mrs. Juliet studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. Then she leaned back in her chair and waved her hand dismissively. "Very well. You may go." Jonathan left the room, his heart pounding. The envelope of money remained on her desk, but the temptation lingered in his mind. For days, Jonathan tried to push the memory of that conversation out of his mind. He threw himself into his work, hoping the routine would drown out the nagging thoughts. But no matter how hard he tried, the image of that envelope haunted him. He thought about his life, the struggles he had faced, the bills he could barely pay. The money Mrs. Juliet had offered could change everything. He could move out of his cramped apartment, buy a car, even start a business. It was a chance to escape the cycle of poverty that had defined his life for so long. But every time he thought about it, Frank's face appeared in his mind. Frank, who trusted him completely. Frank, who relied on him for everything. How could he even consider betraying the one person who had always stood by him? The days turned into a week and Jonathan's resolve began to crack. The temptation was like a whisper in his ear, growing louder with each passing day. He convinced himself that maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Mrs. Juliet was wealthy and powerful. She could provide Frank with a comfortable life. And she had promised to take care of him. Maybe it's not betrayal, Jonathan told himself late one night as he sat alone in the security post. Maybe it's giving him a better life. And I could use the money to help him too. But deep down he knew it was a lie. One sunny afternoon Frank arrived at the gate as he often did. He greeted Jonathan with his usual warm smile, his white cane tapping lightly against the ground. "Jonathan, you've been quiet lately," Frank said as he sat on the bench. "Is everything all right?" Jonathan forced a smile. "Yeah, just work stuff. You know how it is." Frank tilted his head, his unseeing eyes seeming to pierce right through Jonathan. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" "Of course," Jonathan said quickly. "You're my best friend, Frank. I'd never hide anything from you." But the guilt was like a weight on his chest, growing heavier with every word. That evening Mrs. Juliet approached Jonathan at the gate. She didn't say anything at first, simply stood there, her presence as imposing as ever. Finally she spoke. "Have you thought about my offer?" Jonathan hesitated, his heart pounding. I don't know, ma'am. It's a lot to think about." Mrs. Juliet's smile returned, but this time it was tinged with impatience. "Jonathan, let me make this simple. You're a good man, but good men don't get ahead in life. This is your chance to change everything. Don't let it slip away." Jonathan looked down, his mind a storm of conflict. The temptation was unbearable, but the thought of betraying Frank was even worse. "I need more time," he said finally. Mrs. Juliet nodded, though her eyes were sharp. "Take all the time you need. But remember, opportunities like this don't come twice." As she walked away, Jonathan felt the walls closing in around him. He was standing on the edge of a cliff and he didn't know how much longer he could hold on. The days passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Jonathan's mind was a battlefield of guilt and temptation, and every time he saw Frank's trusting smile, the weight on his chest grew unbearable. The image of the envelope full of money haunted him, a constant reminder of what he could have if only he crossed the line. One night, after hours of restless tossing in bed, Jonathan made his decision. He convinced himself that this was not betrayal but an opportunity, a way to ensure both his and Frank's futures. Mrs. Juliet was wealthy and powerful. Frank would be safe, cared for, and maybe even happy under her roof. At least that's what Jonathan tried to believe. The next morning he approached Mrs. Juliet, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Juliet's lips curled into a victorious smile. "I knew you'd come around, Jonathan. You've made the right choice." She handed him the envelope of money and this time he didn't refuse it. "Bring him here tonight," she said. "And don't worry. I'll make sure everything is taken care of." Jonathan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and dread. He clutched the envelope tightly as if holding it would make the guilt go away. But it didn't. That evening Jonathan sat at the security post waiting for Frank. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the driveway. He rehearsed the words in his head, trying to make his betrayal sound like an act of kindness. When Frank arrived, his face lit up with the familiar warmth of their friendship. "Jonathan, you sound tense. Is everything okay?" Jonathan forced a smile. "I'm fine, Frank. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." Frank tilted his head, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "Well, you know Mrs. Juliet, right? The woman I work for." "Of course. You've mentioned her a few times. She heard about you. About how talented and hardworking you are, even with your condition. She wants to help you, Frank. She thinks you deserve better than the life you're living now." Frank's brow furrowed. "Help me. How?" Jonathan hesitated, the words catching in his throat. She wants you to stay at the mansion. She said she could provide you with everything you need. Comfort, security, even opportunities. It's a chance to live a better life, Frank. Frank was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. That's unexpected. But why would she want to do that? She doesn't even know me. She's a generous person, Jonathan lied, his stomach twisting. And she trusts me. She knows you're my best friend and she wants to help. Frank smiled faintly. You think I should do it? Jonathan swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on him. Yeah, Frank. I think it's a good idea. You deserve this. Frank nodded slowly. If you think it's the right thing, Jonathan, I trust you. Those words cut deeper than any knife. That night, Jonathan guided Frank into the mansion. Mrs. Juliet was waiting in the grand foyer, her polished smile masking the darkness beneath. Welcome, Frank, she said warmly, her voice dripping with false kindness. I've heard so much about you. Thank you, ma'am, Frank said, his voice polite but hesitant. It's very kind of you to offer me this opportunity. Mrs. Juliet glanced at Jonathan, her smile widening. It's my pleasure, Frank. You're in good hands here. Jonathan forced himself to stay composed as Mrs. Juliet led Frank deeper into the house. He watched them disappear down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The guilt was unbearable, but he told himself it was too late to turn back now. Over the following days, Frank began to realize something was wrong. Mrs. Juliet's kindness was a facade, and her true intentions became clear the first night she summoned him to her private quarters. Her tone was cold, her demands firm, and her threats chilling. If you don't do exactly as I say, Frank, she hissed, I'll make sure you disappear. No one will come looking for you. Not even Jonathan. Frank's heart shattered at those words. Jonathan, his closest friend, the one person he trusted above all else, had brought him into this nightmare. The days turned into weeks and Frank's torment only grew. Mrs. Juliet's cruelty knew no bounds. She used him for her own twisted pleasures, controlling him with threats of violence and manipulation. Frank felt trapped, betrayed, and utterly alone. But even in the darkest moments, he clung to a sliver of hope. He refused to believe that Jonathan had done this willingly. There had to be an explanation, a reason for his friend's betrayal. Jonathan, meanwhile, was consumed by guilt. The money Mrs. Juliet had given him sat untouched in his apartment, a constant reminder of his betrayal. He couldn't bring himself to spend a single naira, knowing the cost it had come at. Every time he saw Frank around the mansion, his stomach churned with shame. But he couldn't bring himself to face his friend, to admit the truth of what he had done. One evening, as Jonathan sat alone in the security post, Grace, the maid, approached him. She was a quiet woman who rarely spoke, but tonight her expression was grave. Jonathan, she said softly, I need to talk to you. Jonathan looked up, startled. What is it, Grace? It's about Frank, she said, her voice trembling. I've seen what's happening to him. What Mrs. Juliet is doing. It's wrong, Jonathan. We have to do something. Jonathan's heart sank. I know, Grace, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. But what can we do? He's too powerful. If we try to stop her, she'll destroy us. Grace shook her head. We can't just stand by and let this happen. Frank doesn't deserve this. He's your friend, isn't he? Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. He was. But I betrayed him, Grace. I sold him out for money. I don't deserve to call him my friend. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. Then make it right. Help me get him out of here. It's not too late, Jonathan. For the first time in weeks, a spark of hope flickered in Jonathan's chest. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to undo the damage he had done. Grace's words lingered in Jonathan's mind long after their conversation. The guilt that had suffocated him for weeks now carried a new weight, the possibility of redemption. But the thought of standing up to Mrs. Juliet terrified him. She was powerful, ruthless, and capable of unspeakable things. Still, every time he saw Frank, his once cheerful and trusting friend reduced to a shadow of himself, the shame clawed at him. Jonathan had made a grave mistake, but Grace was right. It wasn't too late to set things right. Late one night, while the mansion was quiet, Jonathan crept to the kitchen where Grace was waiting. She had been working discreetly, gathering information and planning their escape. I found a way, she whispered as Jonathan entered. Mrs. Juliet will be leaving for a business trip tomorrow morning. She'll be gone for hours. That's our chance. Jonathan nodded, his heart pounding. What do we need to do? Grace spread out a rough sketch of the mansion on the table, pointing to the servants' entrance. This door leads to the back garden. It's not as heavily locked as the main gate, and I've managed to get a spare key. We'll take Frank out through there and head straight to the police station. Jonathan's stomach churned. The police? You think they'll believe us? They will when they see what's in Mrs. Juliet's secret room, Grace said, her voice firm. I've seen glimpses of it. Ritual instruments, strange symbols. It's horrifying. It's where she keeps the things she uses to control her victims. If we can show them that, they'll have no choice but to act. Jonathan clenched his fists, fear and determination warring within him. All right. Let's do it. The next day Mrs. Juliet left the mansion as planned, her sleek car disappearing down the driveway. Jonathan and Grace wasted no time. They found Frank in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed with a defeated expression. Frank, Jonathan said softly, stepping inside. Frank turned toward him, his unseeing eyes filled with pain. Jonathan? What's going on? Jonathan knelt in front of him, his voice trembling. Frank, I'm so sorry. I've done something unforgivable. I betrayed you. I let Mrs. Juliet bring you here, and I didn't stop her when I should have. Frank was silent for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. I trusted you, Jonathan. You were my best friend. How could you do this to me? Tears welled up in Jonathan's eyes. I don't have an excuse, Frank. I was weak and I gave in to temptation. But I'm going to make it right. Grace and I are getting you out of here. Tonight. Frank's expression softened slightly, though the hurt remained. Why now? Because I can't live with what I've done, Jonathan said. You deserve better, Frank. And I'm going to make sure you're free. Frank nodded slowly. All right. Let's go. The escape began as planned. Grace led the way, clutching the spare key tightly in her hand. Jonathan walked beside Frank, guiding him carefully through the dark hallways. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound made their hearts race. When they reached the servants' entrance, Grace unlocked the door with trembling hands. The cool night air rushed in, filling their lungs with a sense of freedom. But as they stepped into the garden, the sound of a car engine shattered their relief. She's back, Grace whispered, her voice shaking. Panic set in as the headlights of Mrs. Juliet's car appeared at the front gate. They had no time to retreat. Jonathan glanced around, his mind racing. This way, he hissed, leading them toward a dense patch of bushes at the edge of the garden. They crouched low, holding their breaths as the car pulled into the driveway. Mrs. Juliet stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. She paused, her sharp eyes scanning the property. Jonathan, she called, her voice echoing through the night. Jonathan felt his heart stop. He knew. Somehow she knew. For what felt like an eternity they stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe. Finally Mrs. Juliet entered the house, her footsteps fading into the distance. We have to move now, Grace whispered urgently. They slipped out of the garden and onto the quiet street beyond. The city of Kano stretched out before them, its lights twinkling in the distance. Where's the police station? Frank asked, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Not far, Grace said. We'll take a shortcut through the side streets. Follow me. As they navigated the narrow alleys, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise a threat. When they finally reached the police station, relief washed over them like a tidal wave. Jonathan burst through the doors, his voice loud and desperate. We need help, he shouted. There's a woman, Mrs. Juliet, she's holding people against their will. She's dangerous. The officers looked at him skeptically, but Grace stepped forward, her voice calm and persuasive. She has a secret room in her house. It's filled with evidence, ritual instruments, charms, things she uses to control her victims. Please, you have to investigate. Frank added, I'm one of her victims. She used threats to keep me there. She forced me to do things against my will. The officers exchanged glances, then nodded. All right. Show us the house. With a police convoy in tow, they returned to the mansion. Mrs. Juliet was waiting for them, her expression cold and unyielding. What is the meaning of this? She demanded as the officers entered. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. We know what you've been doing, Mrs. Juliet. And we're here to put an end to it. The officers began searching the house, and it wasn't long before they found the secret room. The sight inside was chilling. Candles, strange symbols, and objects that defied explanation. Mrs. Juliet's confident facade cracked as the officers handcuffed her. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice venomous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." But Jonathan didn't care. For the first time in weeks he felt free. As the police took Mrs. Juliet away, Frank turned to Jonathan. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Jonathan. But thank you for getting me out of there." Jonathan nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, Frank. I promise." Frank didn't say anything, but the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. It was a small step toward healing, but it was enough for now. The days that followed Mrs. Juliet's arrest were filled with chaos, relief, and the slow process of healing. The police investigation into her dark deeds exposed a horrifying web of exploitation and manipulation that stretched far beyond what Jonathan and Grace had imagined. Frank's testimony, along with the evidence found in the secret room, ensured Mrs. Juliet would face justice. But for Frank and Jonathan, the scars left by the ordeal wouldn't heal overnight. Frank decided to leave the mansion entirely. With Grace's help, he found a safe haven at a center for the physically challenged, a community of kind-hearted people who welcomed him with open arms. The center provided him with a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Despite the new environment, Frank struggled to reconcile his feelings about Jonathan after being taken to a church for redemption prayers. The betrayal cut deep, and while he appreciated Jonathan's efforts to rescue him, the pain of losing his closest friend's trust lingered. Jonathan, on the other hand, was determined to make amends. He visited Frank regularly, bringing small gifts and spending hours sitting with him in the garden of the center. At first, Frank was distant, his responses short and guarded. But Jonathan remained patient, understanding that trust wasn't something he could rebuild overnight. "Frank," Jonathan said one afternoon, his voice filled with remorse, "I know I hurt you. I betrayed everything we stood for as friends, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I need you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Frank turned toward him, his expression softening slightly. "It's not that simple, Jonathan. What you did, it broke something between us. But I can see you're trying. That counts for something." Grace, too, played a significant role in helping both men heal. She often visited Frank, bringing him news of the outside world and encouraging him to join activities at the center. She also stayed in touch with Jonathan, reminding him that redemption was a journey, not a destination. "You made a mistake, Jonathan," Grace told him during one of their conversations. "But you've shown that you're willing to change. That's more than most people would do. Keep showing Frank that you care, and maybe one day he'll truly forgive you." As the weeks turned into months, Frank began to open up again. He participated in music sessions at the center, his talent on the keyboard mesmerizing everyone who heard him play. The sense of purpose he regained through music was a balm to his wounded spirit. Jonathan continued to visit, often sitting quietly while Frank played. One day, as Frank finished a soulful tune, he turned to Jonathan with a small smile. "Do you remember when we used to talk about starting a band?" Frank asked. Jonathan chuckled, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. "Yeah. You always said you'd be the star and I'd be your manager." Frank's smile grew. "Maybe it's not too late for that." Though the road to healing was long, the bond between the two friends slowly began to mend. Frank's strength and resilience inspired Jonathan, who worked tirelessly to prove he was worthy of forgiveness. In the end, they both learned that even in the darkest times, redemption and second chances were possible. It just took courage, patience, and the unwavering belief that hope could light the way forward.